October 27, 1964, 8:31 p.m. NBC Television Studios, Burbank, California. Ronald Wilson Reagan, a 53-year-old former Hollywood actor whose career has been quietly fading into television commercials and corporate speaking engagements, steps before the cameras to deliver what will become known as a time for choosing speech in support of Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. His hands still bearing the calluses from his youth spent loading freight cars in Illinois, adjust the microphone with the practiced ease of a man who has spent decades before cameras and audiences. In exactly 30 minutes, this speech will transform Reagan from a declining actor into the most powerful conservative voice in America, launching a political career that will culminate in the presidency and reshape the nation's destiny. But as he prepares to deliver these career-defining words, Reagan carries within his very DNA the accumulated political instincts, storytelling abilities, and unshakable optimism of ancestors whose own journeys from poverty to prosperity, from oppression to opportunity, have been building toward this moment for more than 2 centuries. What forces shaped the man who would become known as the Great Communicator? What ancestral streams converged to create someone capable of inspiring millions with his vision of American exceptionalism? What hereditary gifts of persuasion, resilience, and unwavering faith in the possibility of reinvention flowed through the bloodlines that produced Ronald Wilson Reagan? To understand the 40th President of the United States, we must journey backward through the generations that forged his character, through the Irish villages where his paternal ancestors dreamed of American prosperity, through the Scottish Highlands where his maternal forebears learned the arts of survival and storytelling, through the immigrant communities of 19th century America, where these separate family traditions merged and evolved into something uniquely American. For Ronald Reagan was not simply an individual who happened to possess extraordinary political gifts. He was the living embodiment of the American dream itself, the culmination of centuries of ancestral struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering belief in the possibility of transformation. Ronald Wilson Reagan entered the world on February 6, 1911, in a modest apartment above the general store in Tampico, Illinois, born to John Edward Reagan and Nell Clyde Wilson Reagan. His father, known throughout his life as Jack Reagan, had been born on July 13, 1883, in Fulton, Illinois, the son of John Michael Reagan and Jenny Cusick Reagan, whose own love story had begun in the immigrant communities of northern Illinois, where Irish Catholics sought to rebuild their lives after fleeing the devastating poverty and political oppression of their homeland. John Michael Reagan, Ronald's paternal grandfather, had arrived in America in 1860 as a 22-year-old immigrant from County Tipperary, Ireland, carrying little more than the clothes on his back and an unshakable determination to build a better life for the family he hoped to create in this land of opportunity. Born in 1838 in the village of Dooleys, County Tipperary, John Michael had grown up during some of the darkest years in Irish history, witnessing firsthand the devastation of the Great Famine that killed over 1 million people and forced another 2 million to emigrate between 1845 and 1852. John Michael's parents, Michael Reagan and Margaret Mulcahy Reagan, had been tenant farmers whose families had worked the same patch of Tipperary soil for generations, paying rent to English landlords who showed no mercy when potato crops failed and starvation stalked the countryside. Michael Reagan, born around 1810, had inherited from his own father, Patrick Reagan, a deep understanding of how to coax life from difficult soil, but also a burning resentment against the system of English colonial rule that kept Irish Catholics in perpetual poverty despite their hard work, and debarred their agricultural expertise. The Reagan family's Irish roots stretched back even further to Patrick Reagan's father, also named Michael, who had been born around 1780 in County Tipperary during the height of the penal laws that systematically excluded Irish Catholics from land ownership, education, and political participation. Earlier, Michael Reagan had lived through the failed Irish Rebellion of 1798, when United Irishmen led by Wolfe Tone attempted to overthrow English rule with French assistance, only to be crushed by superior British military forces. The brutal suppression of this rebellion, with its mass executions and transportation of prisoners to penal colonies, had taught the Reagan family hard lessons about the costs of confrontation with superior force and the value of patience, persistence, and strategic thinking in the pursuit of long-term goals. These ancestral experiences of political oppression and economic marginalization had instilled in the Reagan bloodline a complex understanding of power dynamics that would prove crucial to Ronald Reagan's later political success. His Irish ancestors had learned to navigate hostile political environments, where survival required the ability to read the motivations and intentions of those in authority, to build coalitions among fellow sufferers, to communicate resistance through indirect means that could not be easily detected or punished by oppressive authorities. They had also developed a deep appreciation for the power of storytelling as a means of preserving cultural identity, transmitting political values, and inspiring hope even in the darkest circumstances. When John Michael Reagan made the agonizing decision to leave Ireland in 1860, he was not simply fleeing poverty, but carrying forward a family tradition of political awareness and strategic thinking that stretched back generations. His journey to America aboard one of the overcrowded immigrant ships that Irish Americans would later remember as coffin ships was itself an act of political resistance, a rejection of the colonial system that had kept his people in chains, a declaration of faith in the possibility that somewhere on Earth there existed a society where hard work and native intelligence could triumph over inherited privilege and systematic discrimination. John Michael's arrival in Illinois placed him in the heart of a state that was itself undergoing profound political transformation during the crucial years leading up to the Civil War. Illinois in 1860 was the political home of Abraham Lincoln, whose debates with Stephen Douglas over the expansion of slavery had captivated the nation and established the fundamental moral framework for the coming conflict. The Irish immigrants flooding into Illinois during these years brought with them their own complex attitudes towards slavery. They opposed the institution on moral grounds, having experienced oppression themselves, but they also feared economic competition from freed slaves and resented being conscripted to fight in a war that many viewed as benefiting primarily the interests of Protestant Anglo-Americans, who had often discriminated against Irish Catholics. It was in this politically charged environment that John Michael Reagan met and married Jenny Cusick, a young Irish-American woman whose own family had fled the same County Tipperary devastation that had driven the Reagans to seek their fortune in America. Jenny had been born in 1849 in Illinois to Thomas Cusick and Catherine O'Sullivan Cusick, immigrants who had arrived in America during the worst years of the Irish famine, carrying with them not just their own survival instincts, but the accumulated wisdom of families that had endured centuries of political and economic uncertainty. Thomas Cusick, Ronald Reagan's great-grandfather, was born around 1820 in County Tipperary, the son of farmers whose own ancestors had witnessed the gradual erosion of Irish independence through successive waves of English conquest and colonization. The Cusick family had managed to maintain their Catholic faith and their Gaelic cultural traditions despite centuries of persecution, passing down through oral tradition the stories, songs, and political insights that had enabled their survival under hostile rule. Thomas had learned from his father Patrick Cusick, born around 1795, the crucial importance of adaptability in the face of changing circumstances, the value of education as a tool for advancement, and the necessity of building networks of mutual support within immigrant communities. Catherine O'Sullivan Cusick, Jenny's mother and Ronald Reagan's great-grandmother, brought to her marriage with Thomas Cusick an equally rich heritage of survival and resistance. Born around 1825 in County Cork, Catherine came from a family that had been deeply involved in the Irish struggle for Catholic rights and political independence. The O'Sullivan clan had produced several prominent figures in Irish nationalist movements, including members who had participated in Daniel O'Connell's campaign for Catholic emancipation in the 1820s and 1830s. Catherine's father, Dennis O'Sullivan, born around 1800, had been a supporter of O'Connell's non-violent approach to political change, believing that strategic patience and coalition building could achieve more lasting results than violent resistance. The political philosophy that Dennis O'Sullivan had passed down to his daughter Catherine, and that Catherine had in turn transmitted to her daughter Jenny, emphasized the importance of working within existing political systems while maintaining clear moral principles and long-term strategic objectives. This approach to political engagement, pragmatic but principled, patient but persistent, would become one of the defining characteristics of Ronald Reagan's later political career, enabling him to build unlikely coalitions and achieve seemingly impossible legislative victories through his ability to find common ground with political opponents while never compromising his core beliefs. When John Michael Reagan and Jenny Cusick married in 1878 in Fulton, Illinois, they were not simply joining two individual lives, but weaving together two family traditions of political engagement, community leadership, and strategic thinking that had been forged in the crucible of Irish resistance to colonial oppression. Their son Jack Reagan, Ronald's father, would inherit from both sides of his family tree a complex understanding of American politics that combined deep appreciation for democratic institutions with hard-earned skepticism about the motivations of those in power. Jack Reagan's childhood in late 19th century Illinois exposed him to the full complexity of American politics during the Gilded Age, when rapid industrialization was creating unprecedented wealth alongside crushing poverty, when waves of immigration were transforming American society, and when the promises of Reconstruction were being systematically betrayed in the American South. Jack learned from his parents' conversations around the dinner table that political progress was possible but never guaranteed, that democratic institutions required constant vigilance and citizen engagement to function properly, and that the American dream was real but accessible only to those willing to work tirelessly for its achievement. The lessons that Jack Reagan absorbed during his formative years included not just political sophistication, but also the storytelling abilities that had enabled his Irish ancestors to preserve their cultural identity under conditions of extreme adversity. John Michael Reagan had brought from County Tipperary a rich tradition of oral narrative that combined historical memory with entertainment value, teaching important lessons about survival and resistance through stories that were engaging enough to hold the attention of listeners across generations. This gift for narrative would prove to be one of the most important inheritances that Jack Reagan would pass on to his son Ronald, providing the foundation for the communication skills that would make Ronald Reagan one of the most effective political speakers in American history. Jack Reagan's adult life was marked by the economic uncertainties that characterized the lives of many working-class Americans during the early 20th century. He worked as a traveling shoe salesman, a profession that required not just sales skills, but also the ability to read human nature, to understand what motivated people to make purchasing decisions, and to build relationships quickly with strangers from diverse backgrounds. The sales techniques that Jack Reagan mastered during his years on the road, the importance of personal connection, the value of storytelling and persuasion, the necessity of projecting confidence even in the face of rejection, would all be absorbed by his young son Ronald, who accompanied his father on sales trips and observed firsthand the arts of persuasion and relationship building. Jack Reagan's political affiliations during his adult years reflected the complex inheritance he had received from his Irish ancestors. He was a Democrat who supported the party's traditional advocacy for working-class interests and immigrant rights, but he was also deeply suspicious of political machines and corrupt politicians who exploited ordinary citizens for personal gain. His political philosophy combined support for social welfare programs with belief in individual responsibility, advocacy for workers' rights with respect for business success, loyalty to Democratic candidates with willingness to vote for Republicans when he believed they better serve the interests of ordinary Americans. The elder Reagan's willingness to think independently about political issues, to judge candidates by their character and competence rather than their party affiliation, to support policies based on their practical effects rather than their ideological purity, would all become hallmarks of Ronald Reagan's later political career. Even when Ronald Reagan switched from the Democratic to the Republican Party in the 1960s, he did so not as a rejection of his father's political values, but as an extension of Jack Reagan's fundamental belief that political loyalty should be earned rather than inherited. Jack Reagan's marriage to Nell Clyde Wilson on November 8, 1904, brought together two family traditions that would prove to be perfectly complementary in shaping their son Ronald's character and worldview. While Jack contributed the Irish tradition of political sophistication and storytelling ability, Nell brought from her Scottish and English ancestry an equally powerful legacy of moral conviction, community service, and theatrical performance that would provide the ethical foundation and communication skills for Ronald Reagan's later success. Nell Clyde Wilson had been born on July 24, 1883, in Clyde Township, Illinois, the daughter of Thomas Wilson and Mary Ann Elsie Wilson, whose own family histories stretched back to the Scottish Highlands and the English countryside where their ancestors had developed the character traits that would prove essential to frontier survival and American success. Thomas Wilson, Ronald Reagan's maternal grandfather, was born in 1844 in Scotland to a family that had endured centuries of clan warfare, religious persecution, and economic hardship in the rugged terrain of the Highland region. The Wilson family's Scottish heritage could be traced back to the 16th century, when Ronald Reagan's ancestors had been members of Clan Wilson, one of the border clans that inhabited the turbulent frontier between Scotland and England. These border families had developed over generations a unique culture that combined fierce independence with strategic pragmatism, loyalty to clan leadership, with willingness to form temporary alliances with former enemies when circumstances required such flexibility. The constant warfare that characterized life in the border regions had taught the Wilson clan that survival required not just physical courage but also diplomatic skill, not just military prowess, but also the ability to read changing political winds and adapt quickly to new circumstances. Thomas Wilson's father, John Wilson, born around 1815 in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, had grown up during the Highland clearances, when English landlords were systematically evicting Scottish tenant farmers to make room for more profitable sheep grazing. John Wilson had witnessed the destruction of traditional clan society, the forced emigration of thousands of Highland families, and the gradual erosion of Gaelic culture and customs that had sustained Scottish identity for centuries. These traumatic experiences had taught him that survival in a changing world required not just preservation of traditional values, but also willingness to embrace new opportunities, not just loyalty to ancient customs, but also adaptability to modern circumstances. The decision by John Wilson to emigrate to America in the 1840s represented not a rejection of his Scottish heritage, but a strategic application of the adaptability that had enabled his clan ancestors to survive centuries of political and economic upheaval. He brought to America not just his own survival skills, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to thrive in uncertain environments, to build communities under challenging conditions, to maintain cultural identity while embracing beneficial change. These lessons would prove invaluable to his descendants as they navigated the equally challenging terrain of American frontier life and democratic politics. Thomas Wilson inherited from his father John not only practical skills for frontier survival, but also a deep appreciation for education and self-improvement that reflected the Scottish tradition of democratic intellectualism. Scotland had developed during the 18th and 19th centuries one of the most advanced educational systems in Europe, based on the principle that every child, regardless of social class, deserved access to learning that would enable individual advancement and community progress. This commitment to education as a pathway to opportunity had become deeply embedded in Scottish cultural values, creating a tradition that viewed intellectual development not as a luxury for the wealthy, but as a necessity for anyone who hoped to improve their circumstances. When Thomas Wilson married Mary Ann Elsie in 1875 in Illinois, he was joining his Scottish heritage of independence and adaptability to an English tradition of moral conviction and community service that would prove equally important in shaping their daughter Nell's character. Mary Ann Elsie had been born in 1858 in Illinois to parents who had immigrated from England during the middle years of the 19th century, bringing with them the religious and ethical traditions that had sustained English Protestantism through centuries of theological and political conflict. Mary Ann's father, William Elsie, born around 1830 in Hertfordshire, England, came from a family that had been deeply influenced by the Methodist revival movement of the 18th century, which had emphasized personal responsibility, social reform, and evangelical commitment to improving the conditions of the poor and marginalized. The Elsie family had been active in Methodist congregations that supported the abolition of slavery, the expansion of educational opportunities for working-class children, and the promotion of temperance as a means of reducing the social problems associated with alcohol abuse. William Elsie had brought these reform commitments with him to America, where he became active in Methodist congregations and community organizations dedicated to moral improvement and social progress. Mary Ann's mother, Sarah Johnson Elsie, had been born around 1835 in Yorkshire, England, to a family that had been prominent in the evangelical movement within the Church of England. The Johnson family had produced several ministers and missionaries who had dedicated their lives to spreading Christian values and improving social conditions in both England and the British Empire. Sarah Johnson had inherited from her family a deep commitment to practical Christianity that emphasized not just personal salvation, but also social responsibility, not just individual moral improvement, but also community-wide efforts to address poverty, ignorance, and injustice. The marriage of William Elsie and Sarah Johnson had thus represented the union of two English Protestant traditions that would prove to be perfectly complementary in their approach to American frontier life. Both families had emphasized the importance of education, moral conduct, and community service as the foundations of personal success and social progress. Both had developed strong traditions of public speaking and religious leadership that had equipped their descendants with the communication skills necessary for success in democratic politics and community organization. Nell Wilson Reagan inherited from both sides of her family tree a powerful combination of intellectual sophistication and moral conviction that would prove to be one of her most important gifts to her son Ronald. From her Scottish father, she received an appreciation for education and self-improvement that led her to become one of the most well-read and intellectually curious women in her community. From her English mother, she inherited a commitment to Christian service and moral leadership that made her a natural leader in church and community organizations throughout her adult life. But perhaps most importantly, Nell inherited from both family traditions a gift for dramatic performance that would prove to be crucial in developing Ronald Reagan's later success as a communicator and political leader. The Scottish tradition of storytelling, with its emphasis on narrative drama and emotional engagement, combined with the English tradition of religious oratory, with its focus on moral persuasion and inspirational messaging, to create in Nell Wilson a natural performer who could captivate audiences through her ability to bring stories to life and to connect abstract moral principles to concrete human experiences. Nell's involvement in amateur theatrical productions throughout her adult life provided Ronald Reagan with his first exposure to the arts of performance. But more importantly, it taught him that effective communication required not just the transmission of information, but also the creation of an emotional connection between speaker and audience. Nell's performances in church pageants and community theater productions demonstrated to her young son that successful public speaking required careful attention to timing, pacing, and dramatic effect. That the most powerful messages were those that combined intellectual content with emotional resonance. That audiences could be moved to action through appeals that engaged both their minds and their hearts. The religious training that Nell provided for her son Ronald reflected the synthesis of Scottish intellectual tradition, and English evangelical commitment that she had inherited from her parents. She taught Ronald to view Christianity not as a set of abstract theological principles, but as a practical guide for daily living that emphasized personal responsibility, community service, and optimistic faith in the possibility of positive change. The Bible stories that she shared with Ronald were presented not as ancient history, but as timeless examples of how ordinary individuals could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through faith, persistence, and moral courage. This religious foundation would prove to be one of the most important influences on Ronald Reagan's later political philosophy, providing him with an unshakable optimism about human potential and American possibilities that would enable him to inspire millions of voters even during periods of national crisis and uncertainty. The faith that Nell Wilson Reagan instilled in her son was not the pessimistic Christianity that emphasized human sinfulness and divine judgment, but rather the hopeful Christianity that emphasized divine grace and human possibility. Not the fearful religion that sought to avoid worldly engagement, but rather the confident religion that sought to transform worldly conditions through faithful service and moral leadership. The economic challenges that the Reagan family faced during Ronald's childhood reflected the broader uncertainties that characterized American life during the early 20th century, when rapid industrialization was creating both unprecedented opportunities and devastating economic instability. Jack Reagan's work as a traveling shoe salesman provided the family with a middle-class income during good years, but the seasonal nature of his business and the periodic economic downturns that characterized the American economy during this period meant that the Reagan household was constantly, aware of the fragility of economic security and the importance of hard work, careful planning, and community support in maintaining family stability. These early experiences of economic uncertainty taught Ronald Reagan important lessons about the relationship between individual effort and economic success that would later influence his political philosophy and policy positions. He learned from observing his parents' struggles that prosperity was possible for those willing to work for it, but that economic security required not just individual effort, but also broader economic conditions that supported business growth and job creation. He also learned that economic hardship was not necessarily a reflection of personal failure, that even hard-working and responsible people could face financial difficulties due to circumstances beyond their control, and that community support and government assistance might sometimes be necessary to help families through temporary crises. The Reagan family's frequent moves during Ronald's childhood, from Tampico to Chicago to Galesburg to Monmouth and finally to Dixon, Illinois, exposed him to a wide variety of American communities and social conditions that broadened his understanding of national diversity and complexity. Each of these communities had its own economic base, social structure, and political culture, providing Ronald with first-hand experience of how American democracy functioned at the local level, and how national political trends affected different communities in different ways. In Dixon, Illinois, where the Reagan family finally settled when Ronald was 9 years old, he encountered for the first time a stable community environment that allowed him to develop lasting friendships, pursue long-term interests, and begin to understand his own talents and ambitions. Dixon was a prosperous agricultural community that combined small-town values with economic dynamism, traditional social relationships with openness to new ideas and opportunities. The community's prosperity was based not just on agricultural production, but also on its role as a regional commercial center that connected rural producers with urban markets, creating an economic environment that rewarded both individual initiative and cooperative effort. The social environment of Dixon provided Ronald Reagan with his first opportunities to develop the leadership skills and communication abilities that would later prove crucial to his political success. As a student at Dixon High School, he participated in football, basketball, track, and swimming, learning the lessons about teamwork, competitive strategy, and performance under pressure that would serve him well in his later careers in entertainment and politics. More importantly, His involvement in the school's drama program provided him with formal training in the arts of performance and public speaking that built upon the foundation that his mother had provided through her own theatrical activities and religious teaching. Ronald's work as a lifeguard at Lowell Park during his high school and college years provided him with additional opportunities to develop the confidence and leadership abilities that would characterize his later success. The responsibility of protecting swimmers from drowning required not just physical strength and swimming ability, but also the capacity to make quick decisions under pressure, to project authority in emergencies, to maintain alertness and focus over long periods of potentially monotonous duty. The experience of saving 77 people from drowning during his 7 years as a lifeguard taught Ronald Reagan that individual action could make the difference between life and death, that personal responsibility was not just a moral principle but a practical necessity, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary achievements when circumstances required heroic effort. The lessons that Ronald Reagan learned during his years in Dixon about the importance of individual responsibility, community cooperation, and optimistic faith in human potential would provide the philosophical foundation for his later political career. But equally important were the communication skills that he developed through his participation in high school debate, drama productions, and student government activities. These experiences taught him that effective leadership required not just good ideas, but also the ability to articulate those ideas in ways that inspired confidence and motivated action. That political success depended not just on policy expertise, but also on the capacity to connect with ordinary citizens through appeals that engaged their emotions as well as their intellects. Ronald Reagan's decision to attend Eureka College, a small Christian liberal arts institution in central Illinois, reflected both his family's financial limitations and their commitment to education as a pathway to opportunity and service. Eureka College had been founded by the Disciples of Christ denomination as an institution dedicated to preparing young people for lives of moral leadership and community service, combining rigorous academic training with character development and practical preparation for careers in business, education, and public service. The college's small size and residential character created an intimate educational environment where students could develop close relationships with faculty mentors and fellow students, where individual talents could be recognized and developed, and where leadership opportunities were available to all students regardless of their family background or economic circumstances. At Eureka College, Ronald Reagan discovered his passion for dramatic performance and public speaking, talents that had been nurtured by his mother, but that found their full expression in the college's theater program and debate team. His performances in college dramatic productions demonstrated not just natural acting ability, but also the capacity to connect with audiences through emotional authenticity and compelling stage presence. His success as a member of the college debate team showed that he possessed not just communication skills, but also the intellectual agility and competitive instinct necessary for success in political argument and persuasion. But perhaps most importantly, Ronald Reagan's college years provided him with his first experience of political leadership and activism. His involvement in student government, including his role in leading a student strike against proposed budget cuts that would have eliminated several academic programs, demonstrated that he possessed the courage and organizational ability necessary for effective political action. The strike's success in forcing the college administration to reverse its budget decisions taught Reagan that ordinary citizens could influence powerful institutions through organized resistance, that democratic principles could be applied effectively even in hierarchical organizations, and that leadership required not just personal charisma, but also the ability to build coalitions and maintain group solidarity under pressure. The education that Ronald Reagan received at Eureka College was not limited to formal classroom instruction, but included extensive exposure to the intellectual and cultural traditions that had shaped American democratic values and institutions. Through his coursework in history, literature, and philosophy, he developed an understanding of the complex historical forces that had created American society, the philosophical principles that justified democratic government, and the literary traditions that had shaped American cultural identity. This intellectual foundation would prove crucial to his later political success, providing him with the historical perspective and cultural literacy necessary to communicate effectively with educated audiences, while maintaining his appeal to ordinary citizens who shared his fundamental values. But Bud lacked his formal educational background. The economic pressures that Ronald Reagan faced during his college years, including his need to work his way through school and to contribute to his family's financial support, taught him additional lessons about the relationship between individual effort and economic achievement that would influence his later political philosophy. His work washing dishes in his dormitory, serving as a lifeguard during summer breaks, and participating in various campus employment programs, demonstrated that economic success was possible for those willing to work hard, but also that educational opportunity required community support and institutional assistance that made it possible for young people from modest backgrounds to develop their talents and pursue their ambitions. By the time Ronald Reagan graduated from Eureka College in 1932, he had developed the fundamental character traits and communication skills that would enable his later success in radio, motion pictures, and politics. From his Irish ancestors, he had inherited the political sophistication and storytelling ability that made him a natural communicator and coalition builder. From his Scottish and English ancestors, he had inherited the moral conviction and optimistic faith that provided the ethical foundation for his political philosophy. From his parents, he had learned the importance of hard work, personal responsibility, and community service as the foundations of individual success and social progress. From his college education, he had gained the intellectual sophistication and cultural literacy necessary for leadership in a complex democratic society. All of these influences, the centuries of ancestral struggle and survival, the family traditions of political engagement and moral leadership, the community experiences that taught him about American diversity and democratic possibility, the educational opportunities that developed his natural talents and provided him with essential knowledge and skills, had converged to create in Ronald Reagan a unique combination of abilities that would prove perfectly suited to the challenges and opportunities of 20th century American new politics. As Ronald Reagan stood before the television cameras on that October evening in 1964, preparing to deliver the speech that would launch his political career, he carried within his heart and mind the accumulated wisdom of all those who had come before him. The political sophistication of his Irish ancestors, who had learned to navigate hostile political environments through strategic thinking and coalition building, combined with the moral conviction of his Scottish and English ancestors, who had developed traditions of community service and ethical leadership, to create in Reagan a political philosophy that was both pragmatic and principled, both ambitious and idealistic. The storytelling abilities that he had inherited from generations of Irish ancestors, refined through his mother's theatrical activities and his own college dramatic training, enabled Reagan to communicate complex political ideas through simple narratives that connected with ordinary citizens' experiences and aspirations. The optimistic faith that he had learned from his mother's religious teaching, reinforced by his own observations of American opportunity and democratic possibility, provided him with the unshakable confidence in human potential and national destiny that would inspire millions of Americans during some of the most challenging periods in the nation's history. When Ronald Reagan began to speak that evening about the choice facing America between freedom and tyranny, between individual liberty and government control, between optimistic faith in human potential and pessimistic acceptance of decline and decay, he was not simply articulating his own personal political philosophy, but giving voice to centuries of ancestral wisdom about the conditions necessary for human flourishing and democratic success. The speech that transformed him from a fading actor into a rising political star was the culmination of a journey that had begun in the Irish villages, where his great-great-grandparents had dreamed of American opportunity, continued through the Scottish Highlands, where other ancestors had learned the arts of survival and adaptation, and reached its fulfillment in the American communities where these separate family traditions had merged and evolved into something uniquely American. The Ronald Reagan who emerged from that television studio as a national political figure was not simply an individual who had discovered his political calling, but the living embodiment of the American dream itself. The culmination of centuries of immigration, struggle, adaptation, and achievement that had transformed separate European traditions into a new form of democratic leadership, perfectly suited to the challenges and opportunities of the modern world.